What if I told you there was a way to save time and find deals to help you save money? Well, Instacart delivers. Right now, they are offering free delivery on your first order over $35. They connect you with personal shoppers in your area to shop and deliver groceries from your favorite stores. Follow the link in the show notes and let Instacart know the ExEm podcast sent you. It really helps support our show.
Welcome to the ExEm podcast. Here is your host, mental health therapist, Matthew Kanabe.
I am very hard on myself, dealt with severe anxiety.
And it made me feel like a monster. I didn't have the energy to care.
There was just nothing more but to face what I had been running from.
I'm already an anxiety-filled mess.
It's just love. Like, it just goes back to love.
Greetings, and thank you for coming back and checking out the ExEm podcast. Today, we have a topic that I know needs to be discussed, and our guest is perfect to have for this conversation. She has authored dozens of books, including God, Sex, and Your Marriage. She is the host of the podcast Java with Juli, and you may remember her from her time as a radio personality with Focus on the Family. You can now find her speaking and teaching on all things related to intimacy and sexuality and how it is related to God's design. Please welcome to the show, Dr. Juli Slattery.
Thanks, Matt. It's a joy to be on the show with you. I am an Akron native, so grew up right around the corner from where Emerge now sits, and have moved in and out of the city and state throughout my lifetime. But I'm happy to be back living in Akron with my husband. We have 3 young adult sons who now all live back in Akron too. So I'm a happy mama. Mm-hmm. And my background is I'm a clinical psychologist. And over the years, God has given me a variety of different ministry roles related to counseling, speaking, writing. And for the last 10 or 12 years, I've been running a ministry called Authentic Intimacy. And we specifically deal with issues of sexuality, just helping people find God and his love through various challenges and struggles that they encounter related to sexual issues.
You know, I want to talk a little bit about that. And before we do, you were at Focus on the Family for a long time. You were on air, and you and I had a conversation a couple of days ago. Talk to me a little bit about the journey from doing kind of what you were doing and where God had you. And then all of a sudden you go into really a whole different arena with authentic intimacy. I'd like to kind of hear about that transition and maybe what God was doing in your life at that time, because that's not an easy move by I can't imagine.
No, from the outside looking in, it didn't make a whole lot of sense. And Focus on the Family was just a great opportunity that God opened up for me. I really learned so much working there and was blessed to be a part of the broadcast team and some of the other things that great ministry was doing. I would say probably around 2010, 2011, when I was at Focus, the Lord just started to really take me on a deep personal journey in my own walk with him. And it was kind of out of the blue. It wasn't like a huge crisis was happening in my life, but he just started to call me to spend more time with him and to seek him more deeply. And for people who have been through a season of life like that, you know, it kind of wrecks you. Yeah. And it started to wreck me, to help me realize that my relationship with God was in some ways very superficial. Like, I became a Christian at a young age, always wanted to serve the Lord, always wanted to obey him, but really didn't know what it was to have a deep, intimate relationship with God. And really had underneath the surface a lot of questions about God's love and about just his personal love for me. So he started taking me through that deep time of seeking. And it was probably about 6 or 7 months into that where he started to lay this burden on my heart related to sexuality and sexual brokenness. Mm-hmm. And it was such a profound calling at that time that I actually experienced a physical pain in my chest that would wake me up in the middle of the night, that would just draw me to my knees in prayer. When I was walking through that, a woman named Linda Dillow, who some people might be familiar with, she's an older woman, was mentoring me, and she started to say, God is putting a call on your life. You need to start asking him what it is.
Mm.
And at first I thought, what do you mean God is putting a call in my life? I work for Focus on the Family. Millions of people hear me on the radio every day. I'm already in a call.
Hmm.
But she said, no, 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 God is giving you a specific call. So I started to ask the Lord, what is this burden about? And over the course of a few months, he really showed me that it was about sexual brokenness and how wonderful ministries like Focus were doing a good job getting more generalized content out there, but that specifically on issues related to sexuality, the church in general was sort of doing a flyover on those topics and not going deep in the trenches with people who were really crying out to the Lord with suffering related to all kinds of sexual brokenness, whether it be trauma from their past, a marriage issue, infidelity, sexual addiction, same sex attraction, and gender dysphoria, and all these things that we tend to silo and say, oh, that's a separate issue. I began to see this as like a spiritual terrain that the church had really neglected.
Hmm.
And when the church neglects an area, the people who are suffering really feel like God doesn't care and doesn't meet them in that arena. And so over the course of the next year, God just made it really obvious, in some ways, moving heaven on and earth to let me know that this is what he had planned for me. And it was so obvious to me that this is what he called me to, that it actually wasn't a hard decision to leave Focus when I made it. It was like, I just know I have to do this. And whatever the
Hmm.
cost, I just know I can't say no to this. So it was a step of faith, but God was so gracious in making that call clear that it didn't really feel like a step of faith in the
Yeah.
moment.
I got to commend you because I think that by nature, as you were kind of alluding to, the church does the flyover oftentimes with sexuality. And I commend you because I think it's an area that it'd be a lot easier to go, I'm just gonna, I get that that's there. I'm just gonna maybe head in this direction. In 2010, 11, 12, when you were starting to feel that, what were your thoughts on like, well, what does that mean? Like, what do I do with this calling of really kind of going into understanding what intimacy is, talking about sexuality under the construct of what understanding who God is? I mean, those are things I think are really, really difficult conversations. And where do you think God was sending you in that time? And share a little bit about that transition and process for you.
Yeah. Matt, if God back then would have given me a fast forward view to where I'd be now and the kinds of things I'd be dealing with now, I don't know that I would have had the courage to say yes.
Mm.
But at the time, it was just like, do the next thing. And so it's not like he laid out this big vision for me of what this ministry would become or even what would happen in our culture in the last 10 or 12 years. It was just take this one step. And so one day I was just on my knees. I happened to be fasting at the time and was just praying,
Mm.
Lord, would you just show me what this burden for sexuality is? And he just gave me in that prayer time, Isaiah 61, 1-3. And at the time I couldn't have told you where that verse was. I had to look it up, find it. But it's really about how Jesus came to bind the brokenhearted and to set captives free and to exchange beauty for ashes. And so I looked up that verse in my Bible. I wrote the date. I believe it was July 2011. And I just wrote, this is your call in my life.
Wow.
And then like 3 days later, I get this random call from a guy in Focus on the Family, New Zealand. And about a year prior to that, I had been in New Zealand speaking and just doing some general speaking for women on marriage and had talked a little bit about sexuality. And this guy tells me that for the last year, ever since I was there, like 3 of these men from New Zealand had been asking God to raise up a woman to address sexuality. And they had looked all over New Zealand and had been praying about this, in all honesty, kind of out of their own marriage pain. Like, who's talking to women about this issue? And he said, it's really weird, but all 3 of us just keep getting your name from the Lord. So then they end up flying over to the United States and meeting with me, and they commissioned me. And then I brought Linda Dillow into it to create Passion Pursuit, which was our first resource at Authentic Intimacy. And I thought I would just create that resource and stay focused on the family and be done with this, and then I could move on. But as we started creating this resource and piloting the resource in New Zealand and Australia and in the US, like the response that we got from women was just amazing. Like it was just an outpouring of the spirit and this evidence of women were dying for people to be honest and to have a place to talk about these issues. And then it was just really clear that God was saying, this isn't a resource, it's a ministry. So Matt, I just kept taking each step. At first I thought, okay, we're starting a ministry to married women on sexuality. And that lasted for about 5 minutes until I was like, wow, all these single women want to be part of this too. So single women are sexual. And then it evolved to men and women in churches. And then it evolved to also church leadership. And of course, in our culture, a lot of the pressing questions about LGBTQ and gender. And so I've been on a learning curve with everybody else these last 12 years, just doing the next thing that God puts in front of me. And it's still like that. I still can't tell you where our ministry will be in 5 years. I just want to keep waking up and saying yes to what's in front of us today.
So there's two different things that I want to touch base on, but authentic intimacy, and that started in 2012. Talk to me about what is that? When people go to the website and when people try to connect with that, what are we talking about? And then the second part of the question is I want to talk about sexual discipleship and what that is, because there's two different things kind of happening, and I'd love for our audience to really understand what those are.
Sure. So authentic intimacy is really a teaching and discipleship ministry. And when you go to that website, you're going to see we identified that there are 6 user journeys or reasons that people come to the website. And so we try to divide the teaching and content and small group opportunities into those 6 user journeys. So people that are finding freedom from sexual sin, people that are looking for healing from different kinds of sexual pain, people that are single and trying to make sense of their sexuality, marriage and sexuality, parenting and sexuality, and then engaging with cultural issues. And so we have, I think, about 500 podcast episodes and hundreds of blogs, webinars, all related to those different areas of questioning and pain and brokenness. And then we also have books and Bible studies, and we have what we call online book studies, where anywhere from the world you can join these book studies and go through books discussing and just being discipled in some of these areas. And then we have something called online coaching intensives, which goes a step deeper and working with somebody who's trained in a group setting to address things like how do you recover from a betrayal in marriage, or what is the journey to reintegrating sexuality in your marriage after, like an affair. What does that look like? Or how do you deal with sexual pain? So we also have events. So some of them in Northeastern Ohio and then other places around the country, addressing marriage, addressing cultural issues. So that's kind of what authentic intimacy has become.
That's good. And so I think you and I kind of touched on this in our conversation. I know Emerge probably over the last couple of years has fielded more phone calls from leaders in the church, pastors, about it seems to me that there is a lot of hot topics over the last couple of years that have come to the forefront. And I think a lot of our leaders and our pastors don't know how to address a lot of these things. This is a loaded question, so I'm not asking you to kind of go, here's the answer and a nice, concise, whatever. But I know right now a lot of pastors are listening. And so if someone is pastoring a church and they're feeling overwhelmed with some of the cultural issues, with some of the things that are going on in the world, feeling like a lot of these things surrounding sexuality have just kind of come to the forefront. Now, they've always been there, but you know what I mean? Where we feel like over the last couple of years, there's just been a new surgence of conversations, of media attention. again, it's a loaded question, but I'm just kind of wondering what are some of your thoughts around that, and it's really educating me too. What would you say to a pastor or a leader in the church, missionary, to how do we start handling this conversation?
Yeah. Well, first of all, a lot of empathy for pastors and Christian leaders. When I do trainings for pastors, I sometimes will ask them, how many of you have had more than one class in your training on sexuality? And I've rarely had more than one or two people raise their hand in a room of maybe 100 pastors. And so they have very little training, and they also have had very little help in navigating some of these own challenges in their own lives. And then they are asked to handle, deeply painful, controversial personal issues like some of the ones that we've already mentioned. So I have a lot of empathy for what they're facing. And I'm thankful that God has called me and other people to this kind of ministry, because we do need to have people within the body of Christ who are dedicated full time to doing this kind of work, to the biblical integration of sexuality. So you have resources like that available to you. But I would also say that this is something that no longer can be referred out. The way I think we need to shift and think about it is that Christians are being sexually discipled by the culture. Every day they're bombarded with messages of what to think about sexuality and how to process their sexuality. And so if they just get one or two hits a year, like a few sermons on biblical sexuality, it's not going to take. So what I really encourage Christian leaders to do is shift from a model of either education or problem solving, where it's like, yeah, like we've got to address this here or there, to a model of discipleship. And that's where sexual discipleship comes in. Like, again, recognizing the church or the culture is discipling in sexuality. Yeah. And so the church and the Christian family has to step up and learn how to disciple in these issues. And so, a lot of my time and effort goes into, well, what does it actually look like? How do we start discipling in sexuality? And a few of the things I would tell a pastor is, first of all, don't think of sexuality as an issue that you have to solve. Think of it as a territory that we need to reclaim. Like, we need to reclaim the narrative of why God created sexuality, why he cares, where he is in the midst of struggles and brokenness. And then the second thing I think it's really important for a pastor to understand is that every sexual issue is also a spiritual issue. That underneath somebody's battle with pornography are real questions about, where's the power of God in my life? And does God still love me even though I keep failing? And with every person's experience of sexual trauma, down deep inside, there's spiritual questions like, can I really trust God? And can I ever be whole? And so it's learning to take the presenting issue of sexuality and really get to the discipleship and spiritual issues that pastors are really already equipped to deal with, as well as really activating the body of Christ and walking with people on that journey.
If somebody's also listening and they're kind of hearing some of this stuff for the first time, in maybe a little bit of a broad stroke, how would you describe God's design for sexuality? If we're, so bombarded by a world's view, which we are, you can't escape it. I work with, majority of the clients I work with are men. Majority of them are young adolescents, young adults. On a daily basis, they're bombarded, whether they're seeking it out or not. It's almost as if you can't get away from images that are seeping into the young brains. So if we were going to start that conversation of, okay, how do we start even talking about what was God's design versus what we're being overwhelmed with on a regular basis?
Yeah, I always think I guess it's the clinician in me, but I always think it's best to start out by asking that young man, what do you think God's design is? How are you processing the purpose of your sexuality? And one of the reasons that I think it's important is because most people don't know how to answer that question. And then they realize they don't know how to answer that question, or they're defaulting to what they've absorbed from culture. Like, God created sexuality to be pleasurable, which he did, but that's not the fullness of it. And so getting people to kind of think, yeah, like, what is his plan? What's the purpose? And then what I really think is key to start with is not, well, God designed sex for marriage, like that's a Christian answer, but God really designed sexuality as a form of revelation. Now that catches people. Okay, what do you mean by that? Well, everything that God created in the world, including our human experiences, he created to reveal. So for example, like he created the need to eat food and the experience of hunger physically to reveal to us that we also have a spiritual need to be fed. And we know what it is to be spiritually hungry or satisfied. So in a similar way, we have to say, okay, God designed male and female. He designed sexuality. He designed sexual desire. He designed sexual pleasure, all to reveal something about himself. And what is that? And when we read the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, most often sexuality is referred to as a metaphor. It's referred to as a metaphor showing us the covenant of God. And we see in the Old Testament all these sexual references that are really referring to Israel's relationship with God, their covenant with God, and times where they were sexually unfaithful. And then in the New Testament, we see that same kind of language with Christ in the church, the new covenant. We hear bridal language and bridegroom language and intimacy language. And so it's really helping people understand and think more deeply that God created sexuality to be a physical experience that helps us understand the nature of how he loves with covenant, which is why marriage is so key to sexuality. And there's a whole lot to unpack there for the single Christian, for the married Christian. But then it also helps us understand why we experience so much pain and brokenness and shame related to sexuality. Because what God created to reveal, Satan is always going to try to destroy or distort. And there's not one person walking the face of the earth who hasn't had their sexual experience at some level distorted by the enemy. And so the gospel message in that is, okay, well, then what does it look like for Jesus to bring redemption so that we can really begin to understand the truth of what God meant to reveal through our sexuality?
Yeah, I think that I'm sure you've heard this before in working with a lot of young people. Like there's a period of time where you're just hit over the head time and time again. Sex is bad. Sexuality is bad. Everything's bad. Everything's bad. And then you get married and it's like, okay, now everything's good. And it's like, it's very difficult to change that mentality because so many things, especially from the Christian worldview, it's bad, it's bad, it's bad, it's bad until it's not. And I think that does a lot of damage. I think there's a lot of people who have, unfortunately, really unhealthy connections and relationship to sexuality. Because I know for me, growing up, we just didn't talk about it. It was like that.
Right.
That was a period of time. It's like you don't talk about it. You don't talk about it, unless you're talking about saying, you don't do it. Why I think it's important that you and I have conversations like this today is I think we have to talk about it. We have to be open and honest and be able to have healthy conversations so we don't demonize sexuality. And we're also helping, people understand that it is a part of God's design. Because so many times I think when we talk about sexuality, we leave God out of it and we don't think about the idea that God has a beautiful intent and a beautiful design within the construct of sexuality. And the way we present it oftentimes in the Christian world is bad, 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 until it's one day we just say it's okay and good. And I think that messes people up.
Yeah, for sure it does. And we have a whole generation of people in their probably 30s who are reacting to that because they grew up with it. But this is the way I think it's better to present it. So are you from Northeastern Ohio like I am, Matt?
I am. I grew up, I've lived a lot of different places, but God eventually brought me back. But I grew up here. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to assume that you're a Browns fan.
Through and through. Yes.
I know. Yes, exactly. So you know what it is to suffer alongside fellow Brown fans like me.
Every
But
Sunday.
every Sunday, I know. So let's pretend that the mayor of Cleveland kept hearing from all these Browns fans how frustrated we were that every year it starts out optimistic, and by week 4 we're like, oh no, it's not this year again.
Yeah.
And so the mayor of Cleveland just decides, you know what, like, I want to boost morale, so let's just pretend that the Browns won the Super Bowl. And so in January, the mayor of Cleveland throws a huge parade in downtown Cleveland to celebrate the fact that the Browns won the Super Bowl. Now that would be a pretty pathetic celebration, wouldn't you say?
I would probably be there because I would just want to buy into it, but I that probably would be a pretty pathetic
Yeah. I mean, it'd be laughable, and it would lack integrity.
That's right.
So that parade is wrong because it's celebrating something that's not true.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when the Cavs won the NBA championship in 2016, there was a parade.
Mm-hmm.
And it was ESPN Sports says it was one of the greatest sports celebration in history.
Mm-hmm.
And there were more people in downtown Cleveland for that parade than actually live in the greater Cleveland area, just to give you an idea. So that was a good parade. Mm-hmm. Now, parades aren't bad in and of themselves. They can be great things, but they're wrong and they're bad if they're false. And in a similar way, God has given the act of sexual intercourse to be a celebration and sealing of the covenant promise of marriage. And so when it truly is celebrating and cementing the vows of a husband and wife, that parade is beautiful, and it's meant to be celebrated. It's meant to be enjoyed. But if you take that same thing and you use it when it's not linked to covenant, it becomes something that lacks integrity. So I think presenting it something like that, so we can have even a context of why is it supposed to be so good and pursued in marriage, but it's not to be outside of marriage. I think that helps people make sense of that dichotomy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really good. Talk to me a little bit then within the context of marriage. What do you think? How do we start even talking about intimacy? If there's an intimacy problem, what do we share within the context of marriage, and how do we start even having the conversation to work towards intimacy if I think a lot of people don't really know what that means?
Right. A lot of people really don't even know, like, this is another question I'll ask Christian married couples. What do you think a great sex life is supposed to look like? Mm-hmm. And it's interesting to see sometimes the blank stares, or even to see like the disconnect between what a husband thinks a good sex life is supposed to look like and what the wife does. And then you ask the question, well, what does God say a good sex life is supposed to look like? Mm-hmm. And so I think one of the main goals is helping married couples get on the same page of what they should actually be working toward. And if we're going off of what I've already shared with you, I believe is expressed through scripture, is marriage, including the sexual relationship, should mirror our covenant relationship with God. Mm. And so when we look at the covenant relationship with God, I wrote a book called God, Sex, and Your Marriage that talks about 4 aspects of God's covenant love that we should be working toward in a sexual relationship and marriage. So faithfulness is the first one. Intimate knowing is the second one. A spirit of sacrificial giving is the third one. And passionate celebration is the fourth one. And so I think for a lot of married couples, even to have a roadmap where they start to actually get on the same page and start to connect, like, yeah, actually working on our sex life is a good thing, and it honors God. Teaching couples not just to talk about their sex life, but to pray together about it. So I think there's a lot of work like that to be done kind of in the pastoral or therapeutic realm to help couples even have the same goal of what should we actually be working towards, because the world tells us it's all about performance. Yeah. And the church just tells us we're healthy as long as we're not cheating. Right. But if we look scripturally, what God defines as a healthy marriage and sex life is far richer.
One of the questions I try to always ask, especially when we have somebody on who is, an expert in their field, like when do people start to go, we need to go outside of the two of us? Like what, oftentimes, like when does things become clinical? When do we need to find a
Mm-hmm.
therapist? When do we need to maybe talk to our pastor? Like, especially when it comes to sexuality, because I think that is one that keeps people from bringing somebody into the conversation. And I think a lot of times with the families and marriages that I work with, they wait till they hit rock bottom before they'll
Yeah.
ever do that. And it saddens me to think of how many years they could have been working towards a healthy sexual relationship, but because of the shame that goes along with it, because of guilt, when is it time for us to go address this with somebody else?
Matt, that's a great question. I think most couples will do nothing for a long time, like you said, until they hit a crisis, until pornography is revealed in the marriage, or one of them engages in an affair, or there's just a totally sexless marriage. But I really think I'll answer your question about when we get help
Mm-hmm.
as far as a counselor, but I really think we're missing the in between.
Mm.
And so most couples don't necessarily need to start with, let's go talk to a counselor about our sex life. They need to start with, let's get some good Christian resources that can help us learn to communicate about this, and help us identify where our thinking has gone awry. And so podcasts and books and studies that are biblical and practical are kind of that middle step again of discipleship. I think even small groups. And there are ways to appropriately talk about these issues with small groups of wives and small groups of husbands, and even small groups of couples who are going through resources that help equip. And so I think everyone should be engaged in that kind of discipleship and conversation. And that's really what's lacking. You do that with conflict management. It's very normal for a small group to talk about how do we address conflict, or any other sort of thing, parenting, money. But for some reason, we don't do this with sexuality. And I think that's an in-between step. Now, when is it time to reach out and get help? I think if you have an issue where that kind of resource that I'm mentioning isn't helping. And some examples of this might be a lot of women experience physical pain during sex. Mm-hmm. And they really need the help of a trained pelvic floor therapist or a sex therapist who can help them physiologically with that issue. A lot of people who use pornography cannot stop, even though they try and they pray and they know it's hurting their spouse. They can't stop. And so that would be an indication that you really need help from somebody who understands the hook of pornography and sexual addiction, and that the spouse also needs help in navigating that. If there's an affair, that is not something you're going to recover from on your own. You're really going to need intervention. Both of you are. Even in terms of when is it wise to start rebuilding marriage, and how much do you share in the disclosure process? Like, that's going to need help. Yes. And then another thing I would mention is sexual trauma. And you know this, Matt, because of the work that you do and the work that Emerge does. There is specific help that is often needed to work through trauma. And if you don't work through it, there's a good chance that you're going to do things like dissociate during sex, or avoid it altogether, or even act out in hypersexualized ways. And so those would be some situations when you need to reach out for some expertise.
Yeah. This is not an easy topic, but I think we should talk about a little bit when you mentioned pornography. Why is pornography such an invasive issue, not only into marriage? And I'm watching numbers and studies, and for a long time it was predominantly male dominated, but that's not really reality anymore. And why is it so dangerous from your perspective? I've talked to many people. I would say, and these numbers are probably a little high, but out of the clients I've seen over the last close to decade, 80 to 90% of them have some type of connection with pornography, sexual addiction of some sort. I mean, and we're talking about thousands of clients, thousands and thousands. I mean, it isn't 50 people, it's thousands of clients. What is it with pornography Again, these are uncomfortable conversations, but ones I think we need to have. And why is it so dangerous?
Yeah, I would say that in my experience, probably about 90% of men have had some struggle with pornography. And depending on the generation, maybe between 30 to 50% of women. So, so I'm with you on those numbers. I think it's incredibly ubiquitous in our day and age.
Mhm.
So why is that? Well, there's a lot of research going on, not just within Christian spheres, but in the mental health space in general, that is really showing how pornography creates this amazing experience in terms of the release of brain chemicals,
Mhm.
like PEA, which has a really long name that I don't know how to say, but it is a brain chemical that's released when you experience sexual novelty, and then that gets mixed with dopamine, and it gets mixed with adrenaline. And that particular combination in our brains is supposed to be like this landmark experience. And if you think about God's design, you would think that God planned this so that a newly married husband or wife would have this incredible experience that would make them want to come back to that again and again and again. But what pornography does, and this is where sexual addiction is different than any other form of addiction. Every other form of addiction requires more, like tolerance is, I need more alcohol today than I did a year ago to feel the high. With pornography, you need different. And so
Mhm.
you need that variety to continue to get that same release of adrenaline and PEA. And so pornography takes you from something maybe that was relatively tame in the beginning to newer things that might involve violence or multiple people or, just all kinds of perversions of sex for you to get that same high. And what a lot of the research is showing is that people usually get exposed to pornography in the young teen years and they learn to use it to cope with life.
Yeah.
And so it can temporarily relieve anxiety and depression and loneliness. It can relieve boredom. And so you find a much higher incidence of trauma or sexual trauma from people that are hooked on pornography. And sometimes it's not even sexual trauma, it's a loss, but they begin self-medicating through pornography and other sexual expression. So that might be generalizing it, but in general, that's what a lot of the research is showing us. Now,
Mhm.
you ask, why is this so dangerous? One of the reasons it's so dangerous is because it's really hard to quit.
Mhm.
You can keep alcohol away from you,
Mhm.
but pornography is available through every device that connects to the internet.
That's right.
And it's almost impossible to get rid of access to it, even if you're trying. But I think another reason it's so dangerous is because pornography uh, is involving sexuality, and sexuality is, especially if you're married, is going to be part of your life. And so, how does somebody who's addicted to pornography experience healthy sexuality within marriage? Well, they can't. What pornography does for both the single and married person is it skews their sexual response. It skews their understanding of sex in terms of objectifying other people. It makes their sex drive all about getting what I need right now, when I want it, how I want it. And so we have a whole generation of young men, the research is showing, that can't even perform sexually with a normal partner because of the impact of pornography. So like, we could spend hours talking about this, and there are people who are real experts in this, but it is very destructive, and the shame that goes with it as well. For a man or a woman who loves the Lord, they love their spouse, but they have this secret that they can't get rid of.
Mhm.
They begin to doubt God's presence in their life, God's love for them, and there are just people crashing and burning over this issue right now.
Yeah. I think one of the other things too I share, and I've probably mentioned it on the podcast, is you're constantly feeding into an industry that is promoting trafficking, that's promoting the abuse of women, the abuse of men, and
Mm-hmm.
so many other things on the other side of the camera that we don't even think about individually. And I think that it's important for people to recognize that those are human beings. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that's one of the scariest thing, working with many clients who have been trafficked and have been utilized in these ways, and they're put on the internet against their will. And the whole thing seems to be just a stirring of Satan's world.
Yep.
And
Yes.
I do think I think it's really important, the psychology behind that pornography is it starts to change the framework of your brain and the way you view sexuality. And then that starts to affect the marriage. And there's so many other relational things, because pornography is a one-way street, and sexuality and intimacy is a connection. And there's a lack of connection in the voyeuristic aspects of pornography, that starts to give us distance, that I believe is very destructive to our engagement with sexuality, because it is about, and I love the way that you said it. It's like, God from Genesis to Revelation shows us this intimacy and how he wants to come together as one. And all of these things are just separating that connection. And so I guess my last question would just be kind of really going into that intimacy again. And why, from your perspective, do you think intimacy is so important to God, and how it not just relates to sexuality, but just the word altogether? And then what does that mean for us in desiring a relationship with him, desiring a relationship with our spouses, or maybe future spouse? Talk a little bit about your perspective on that, and why that is so important.
Yeah. If you really go back to the beginning of humanity, God created us for intimacy.
Mhm.
He created us for intimacy with himself. He created us for intimacy with one another. It was one of the main reasons of his creation. Like, really, there's two reasons. Number one, fellowship and intimacy with us. And number two, to show his glory. And so if we look at why God created, that's essential to what makes us whole as human beings. And we live, particularly in the Western world, in a culture that really sabotages intimacy at every level, and kind of offers the cheap replacement of sexuality. And we were made for intimacy. You can live without sex, but you can't live without intimacy.
Yeah.
And intimacy, not only just in a marriage relationship, that's one unique aspect of intimacy, but intimacy in the parent-child relationship, and the brother-sister relationship, and intimacy in the family of God, and intimacy with God. Like, God didn't create us just so we would obey him. He would have created robots if he wanted that. And one of the reasons that he has given us free choice is so that we could choose him. And intimacy always requires a choice. So I just don't think you can separate the gospel or the heart of the Christian faith without really landing on intimacy being one of the key tenets of why we even exist, and why it's worth fighting for at every level.
That's good. I feel like when I hear intimacy in a godly sense, it's being connected. It's less of me. It's serving. Whereas I think a lot of cultural is about individuality, and it's about me, and more of me, and that kind of thing. And I love that. I think God's design, one, is to be in communion with us, but he desires us to be in healthy communion with each other as well. And, I think a lot of times, as we've talked about, sexuality has been so distorted that it becomes less about being intimate with somebody and more about my own desires. It's about me serving me. And that's really, I think, the epitome of what the enemy wants to do, is move away from God's design and more into I am my own God, or I am in, it's about me. I don't know if that resonates at all with you, or connects with you, but
Yeah, I think ultimately intimacy is about being known and knowing. And like, there's a word in the Hebrew that is actually even used for sexual intercourse. It's the word yada, and it means to know, like to know intimately. The same way in the Greek in the New Testament, the word gnosis. It means not to intellectually know, but to experientially know. And so the deepest intimacy is when I'm deeply known and I'm also deeply knowing the other. So it is both ways. It's giving and receiving, but I think you can be a servant and give and still not be known. And that's not intimacy.
That's
you
good.
know, it's I am risking to show you who I really am, and I'm going to be vulnerable, and I'm going to be patient and persistent enough to wait until I see the true you too. So it's not performance, even service performance. It's the space of knowing.
That's good. Julie, anything else you would like to add to our conversation or to our audience before we go? I always like to give our guests an opportunity. If there's anything else maybe we didn't hit or anything that's on your heart that you would like to share.
Yeah, I guess I would just go back to something I already said. I said that sexuality is not a problem to solve, but a territory to reclaim. And I think for Christian leaders, that's one aspect of the message of we really need to reclaim this area for the sake of the kingdom of God. But I think also that begins with us personally. Like, has God really reclaimed this territory in your own life and in your own heart? And like I said, I think for all of us, and there's healing to be done and freedom to be experienced. So that would be my encouragement, is invite God first to do that in your own heart. And then to equip you to do that in our world today.
That's good. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks for being a part of the ExEm podcast, and really, really appreciate you and talking about this with us today.
Well, it's been a joy. Thanks for letting me share.
Thank you, Dr. Slattery, for sharing your time with me today. This is a huge topic and one that cannot be fully addressed in one podcast. Check out some of Julie's books that you can find online, or her websites listed in the liner notes of today's show. Sex is powerful and often very distorted from the designs that God intended. I think what Julie said about taking a look at ourselves and restoring what has been wounded in our own lives regarding sexuality is imperative to bring healthy intimacy into our marriages and our relationship with God. Well, thank you for listening, and until next time, or when our Savior comes, God bless.